G'day folks, I'm Christopher Biggs. I've been involved with electronic gadgets since I was a teenager and throughout 25 years as a software engineer, architect and manager. I operate a business called Accelerando Consulting, which helps businesses use technology to reduce stress. Really, that's what I believe, that technology is the gradual process of freeing humanity from drudgery and fear. And I started Accelerando because I wanted to contribute to a future that I would be excited to live in. I think a lot about technology, past, present, and future. This is a quote that went dirt ages viral over 20 years ago when Douglas Adams used it in a newspaper column. That's right, I'm convincing you of my up-to-date credentials by leading with a quote that's older than some of you. Anyway, Douglas was paraphrasing artist and technologist Brand Ferren when he said that technology is stuff that doesn't work yet. And Brand was making the point that when things just work, we stop calling them technology. Nobody calls chairs technology, despite the amount of engineering that goes into them, because they almost never go rogue for no visible reason, unlike computers. So today I want to talk to you about what the business world could look like after IoT stops being technology and just becomes an assumed part of the fabric of our lives. I'm thinking of a time when we routinely deal with devices by the thousands or even by the millions. And it's absolutely fabulous how easy it is to build internet-connected devices today, but there are a bewildering array of trade-offs to consider when bringing these devices into organised enterprise. So the bulk of what I'm going to talk about today is what those challenges are and how we might meet them. There won't be time to go into great depth on any given subject, but I'll try to link to presentations and articles where you can learn more. But first, I want to ask, what's the point? Why would we want to fill our homes and cities and even our bodies with connected sensors and other devices? I mean, there are some drawbacks. To some people, the idea of surrounding ourselves with cameras and sensors that are always connected to the internet and over which we have only limited control sounds frightening. It's been said that IoT devices are like vampires. Once you invite them into your home, you have no power over them. You don't even know what threats they enable, and you have no easy way of examining or updating the software on them. It's like those sci-fi futures where location and behavior of everyone is being tracked at all times. Look, I won't argue that there's some awful security out there. I have given presentations in the past that go into all the scary details. And to coin a phrase, the awful truth is out there. But teething troubles come with any new technology. And I do think that the risks can and will be overcome. So let's look ahead to the benefits. What is the Internet of Things for? Well, in my opinion, IoT is for transforming our reach as individuals. IoT lets us ignore the known knowns and learn the known unknowns. That is, it frees us from having to worry about trivial things, and it lets us observe and control the things we care about from anywhere. We don't have to send kids down coal mines anymore. Well, you could say we never really had to, but so much of history is about the folks with the biggest sticks using it to get someone else to do the dirty jobs. And it's not just children who history has handed those dirty jobs. Long ago, the idea of enslaving those different-looking people on the other side of the mountains occurred to history's very first asshole. And even today, when you look at hard, our homes and offices are full of tedious jobs, and a disproportionate of those still fall to women. The developed world tends to implement equity by hiring an immigrant from a poorer country to do the dirty work, the drudgery, the office cleaning, the factory work, the phone support. Not really a fan of this approach myself. Or you could just offshore the whole thing. Now, offshoring isn't always bad, but I think the key point is dignity. My rule of thumb is never outsource a job you wouldn't ask your neighbour to do. So we arrive at the final solution. Let's invent intelligent robots and get them to do all the dirty, boring jobs. Well, the way I see it, this can go one of two ways. Either we succeed or we fail. If we fail, then we need to find a way to make the world as it is more comprehensible to non-intelligent stewards. But what if we succeed? How intelligent is too intelligent to be doomed to do a dirty job forever? Ant equivalent? Parrot? Dog? Ape? Human? Cat? So I give you this thought experiment. Is an artificial intelligence that is smart enough to solve complex problems in fact too smart to be ethically forced to solve them? Should we be paying our dishwashers a living wage? Okay, I might be being slightly facetious here, because intelligence is not the same thing as consciousness. Maybe. We're not really sure. So what I think we should be aiming for is artificial non-intelligence. I propose machines meeting intelligence in the middle. And this is my motivation for IoT, making inanimate things smarter in order to relieve thinking minds from unpleasant tasks. All of which has very little to do with what I want to tell you today, but quite a lot to do with why I want to say it. So we humans invented the idea of technology to give us more time to be human, to watch Netflix, to walk on the beach, to write that novel. And we've come a long way on that goal. We've revolutionised manual labour through steam and electricity. We've revolutionised intellectual labour with computers. And we're poised for a fourth revolution, information and mechanical technology unifying, or in the words of the World Economic Forum, blurring the lines between the physical, the digital and the biological spheres. So let's look at what every wave of the third industrial revolution, the IT revolution, took away. We've had an era of one computer per company, where the most menial information processing tasks were at last taken out of human hands. We're no longer using human beings as computers to do things like add up lists of numbers or calculate functions. The desktop computing revolution saved another tranche of humans. We called them typists, from the need to work as human duplicating machines. Mobile computing freed up a whole bunch of humans from writing stuff down just so we could read it back later. Paper maps, guidebooks, encyclopedia, business reports, telephone directories, these are all now digital goods, web pages that we can look at in our pocket whenever we want to. In just the last decade, cloud computing made even computers themselves intangible. You could run a whole business without ever having to buy a server, to install it in a rack, to ever even touch it. A whole industrial priesthood of system administrators found their working life transformed from a literal world of nuts and bolts to the virtual landscape, where servers and databases and other computing elements are something that you can commission in minutes rather than weeks. And so now we come to the point where these last two waves collide in a massive spray and foam. What comes out the other side when you collide mobile computing and cloud computing is this fine mist of everywhere computing. We get computers that are so small and so cheap that they can be dedicated to any job, no matter how trivial, and so connected that they can be reached from anywhere on the planet or beyond. This is for want of a better name, we call the Internet of Things. But let's break that name down. I spent the first decade of my time as a computer nerd, as a primary and secondary student in the 1980s, using computers that sat alone, interfacing with the world only via a keyboard and a screen. It took about 10 years for us to go from personal computers being networked only at need to us considering any computer that isn't networked 24/7 to be little more than a warm rock. As a tertiary student like yourselves, I first entered a world where one computer on a university network could potentially talk to any other computer at universities around the world. Even then, we used it mostly for humans communicating with humans, for email, and for social interaction, and for documents. And around the time many of you were born, the global computer network spread beyond universities and the military to reach our homes and our workplaces and our schools. When the internet became open to commerce, everything changed. The big revolution of the World Wide Web was not so much that you could put graphics on a screen, or even that you could do it without having to worry about what software or what operating system the reader was using, but that you could do it without having to ask anyone's permission. You could create a service. The World Wide Web changed the world because it became possible to start a business with little more than a new idea and a garage or a spare room. You didn't need a shop front, you didn't need a publisher, you didn't need a distributor. And we got a boom of new grassroots businesses, these startups, and many of them were rubbish and went bust. and a handful made billionaires and became the most successful companies of all time. The way we communicate with each other, the way we shop, the way we receive news and entertainment, even the nature of celebrity is entirely different from what these things were in the 20th century. And this process is now happening. This potential for humans to invent new ways to do things never before possible, with very little barrier to entry for the rest of our interactions with the physical world. Computers and information services begin to disappear inside the things that they represent. We no longer think of as a computerized car or a computerized appliance or a computerized factory. The object is the computer. The computer is the object. Welcome to the Internet of Things. So we've created a moment where, as an enterprise, as a person, as a nation, we have the power to do whatever we want with technology, for great justice or for great evil. What will we do? Well, I've already said that we will use technology as we always have, to obtain benefits while avoiding unpleasant tasks. And these benefits are divided into 6 groups: vision, reach, autonomy, efficiency, insight, and agility. Vision means seeing things that we need to see, knowing things that we need to know, having the information that we need in order to make the best decisions to avoid the worst outcomes. This can be simply knowing the environmental measurements or your rate of resource use, or it can extend to measuring the quality of your output and managing your inventory. I like to say that the goal of enterprise IoT is to kill the clipboard. Anytime you have humans walking around checking items off a checklist or writing down measurements, I see this as an opportunity to improve the process. Why check your freezer temperature once a day when you can monitor it continuously? Why sample your production line output at random when you can test every single item? Why do a manual stock take if you can individually tag and track every item? Reach means being able to exert action at a distance, to be in control of your processes and machinery at every second and with zero effort, to get humans out of the danger zones like mines and foundries and loading docks. Right now, in the midst of the COVID-19 lockdown, we're learning just how much of our enterprises can be remotely operated, but also just how many jobs still have humans in harm's way. I went to the supermarket last week, and I felt for the teenagers staffing the checkouts. These people are in as much danger as frontline medical staff, while being some of the most lowest paid in the workforce. And that leads us to autonomy, the possibility for processes and resources to look after themselves, rather than relying on our conscious and centralized control. The role of human managers becomes to set policy, not to implement it. When we test a piece of safety equipment every 6 months, that means it could have been broken for 179 days the next time we need it. Far better for devices to monitor themselves and report faults the moment they occur. Factories are dangerous places. I met a company this month who used cameras to monitor forklifts and warn operators of imminent collisions. At the Port of Brisbane, there is a container terminal that is 100% robotic, not a single human inside the wire, and when there is, everything stops. For many organisations, efficiency is the key benefit. To be in control of your resources and processes to the degree needed to minimise waste to a far finer level of detail than would be possible through traditional means. So much of the way we use energy in our homes and workplaces is based on the worst case: lighting and ventilating every room regardless of occupancy, applying coarse control because fine control has been intractable, deliberately erring on the side of caution. If we automate all the drudgery, leaving humans the primary role of setting policy, then the best policy comes from superior insight. Measuring and analysing everything has the potential to create a new form of drudgery, that of sifting through the mountains of information in order to derive order from its chaos. And this is why I see information management as a fundamental part of the Internet of Things. The IoT is more than devices. It is more than information. It is also the technologies that connect devices and interpret that information. We not only mechanise the process of collecting information, our systems have the power to autonomously derive wisdom from that data. And this is where For me, IoT has a fundamental antagonism to enterprise IT. Enterprise IT is driven from the top. Decisions are made by the most removed from the operational processes, with consideration of only demonstrable benefit and alignment with long-term strategy. Now, this is not a bad thing, but the potential for continuous improvement arises from IoT when it opposes these principles, when it investigates questions with no known answer, when experimental measurements allow rapid testing of hypotheses and immediate feedback on the value of process changes. So, to derive maximum benefit from IoT in the enterprise, we must value agility and autonomy and accept that top-down planning is not always the best approach. This is going to be in conflict with traditional organisations and traditional management. And so now I want to spend some time examining that conflict. When some line worker or junior manager brings up the idea of incorporating IoT into their workflow, the first thing I predict they're going to hear is some network administrator shouting, "Over my dead body, that technology is not safe for work." Now, this isn't going to be one of those talks that just bleats about how everything in IoT is awful. It's not exactly inaccurate to say that everything is awful, but in my opinion, none of the general miasma of awfulness surrounding IoT is a deal breaker. In fact, I reckon those problems aren't even particularly unique to the Internet of Things. I happen to think that the current situation with the IoT is akin to the American Wild West era. We're in a shortish period of historical turmoil where innovation and growth are running ahead of the law and ahead of common sense. What is different about IoT is the collection of risks arising from the products and technologies. So first up, I want to examine what some of those risks are and how we can avoid them. So our first risk is unauthorized access to your devices. If that device is a video camera, it's pretty clear what the concern is here. Embarrassment, violation, blackmail, burglary, and in the business world, trade secrets and customer privacy are serious matters. And the threats vary by who the perpetrators might be. First, you might have to worry about people who have a malicious intent and a malicious interest in your organisation in particular. Disgruntled employees, corporate raiders, extortion gangs. I have to say that hiring private detectives to spy on takeover targets does happen. Secondly, we have opportunistic griefing like ransomware, which is going wild in the business world. And finally, there's mass data collection, either by randos driving around sniffing for vulnerable devices or by state-level actors. We know from leaks that certain intelligence agencies have developed the ability to insert spyware into smart TVs and routers, and we know that nation-states are engaging in corporate espionage. But our next risk is unauthorized control of your devices. A proof of concept was done recently when some folks managed to turn off home lighting by flying a quadcopter around a neighbourhood. You can bet somebody's working on the same trick for your front door or your factory gate. Cyber war is not a joke anymore. Orchestrated attacks on infrastructure are happening daily. And vandalism is an issue too. I don't want to see someone work out how to wreck every garage door opener in the city or switch off all the pacemakers in a building. A few years back, the electric power company in Puerto Rico was estimated to be losing $400 million a year because an insider leaked how to reprogram the electricity meters by shining infrared light through the plastic casing, bypassing all their tamper protection. Now, you might like free electricity, and it might be briefly funny if someone works out how to subvert autonomous computers into delivering free petrol at the pump or free groceries at the self-serve checkout, but it wouldn't be so funny if all the traffic lights went green at once or all the electricity substations shut down in the middle of a blizzard. The third kind of risk that we saw happen a couple of years ago is mass takeover of devices. In that case, hundreds of thousands of internet-connected security cameras were infected by a worm named Mirai, which used them to perpetuate a denial of service attack against a major DNS provider. Since that time, we've seen even more malicious descendants in the wild. In another incident during one Thanksgiving weekend in San Francisco a couple of years ago, the rail system was shut down by ransomware. The rumour is that they had to pay the ransom to get it back online. You might recall the NotPetya incident a few years ago where hospitals, railways, police cameras and other critical infrastructure were brought down. It looks to have been an act of war disguised as inept ransomware. This time there was no getting your data back, even if you paid up. We had multinational shipping companies and courier companies lose hundreds of millions of dollars each. As a smaller enterprise, what if your delivery truck wouldn't start, or your reception video screen showed ads that you couldn't get rid of, or your lights started strobing on and off at random until you paid a ransom? And then, of course, there's plain old network intrusion. Most networks are set up to defend from outside threats, but what if you just brought a threat into the building? A story from a while ago tells of a US casino that was compromised via their fish tank. That's right, an actual phishing attack with an F. Attackers got into an IoT-enabled fish tank, and they used that as a beachhead to scan the network for vulnerabilities, which they used to set up an exfiltration tunnel to Finland. Most firewalls aren't able to absolutely prevent a device from tunneling traffic to the outside world. In home networks, devices can just use universal plug and play to ask the firewall to forward traffic right to them. And even if you lock down outbound traffic, there are lots of ways to leak information through a firewall. So you need to stop thinking of firewalls as dividing the scary internet from the safe inside. The monsters are probably already inside the room. And if IoT devices rely on cloud services, then there's a risk of those services being compromised as well. So you probably want to just bury your head in the sand right now, or maybe you want to round up all your IoT devices, go down to the beach and bury them under some wet sand. And you've got every right to be concerned. The risks are real and the potential for disaster is serious. Many devices on the market are finicky to install, they're poorly tested, they've got low quality user interfaces and no provision for appropriate maintenance. It almost sounds like we need corporate IT and all their pesky rules after all. Alright, I'm done scaring you for now. So far, we have a big list of reasons as to why we might want to use IoT to find better ways of doing business, and a bunch of reasons why established businesses might be very reluctant to go down the IoT path. So let's look at what advantages we have in our corner. Well, we have what I call the IoT tripod. The three pillars supporting the Internet of Things are ludicrously inexpensive computers, pervasive wireless communications, and composable cloud services. These are the foundations on which we're going to rebuild our enterprises to be part of the fourth industrial revolution, the fusion of data and physical processes that let us do old things better and a whole class of new things besides. But what do I mean by ludicrously inexpensive? Well, let's take a simple task like making sure your freezer stays frozen. When you have $1 million worth of pork bellies in a warehouse, the price of a temperature monitoring system from a traditional automation supplier, which could be over $2,000, doesn't sound so bad. After all, it's an insurance policy. If your freezer breaks down or starts to fail, you have a chance to do something about it before you lose everything. If you're a shopkeeper with $20,000 or $30,000 worth of produce in your cold room, or a cafe across the road from a courthouse where a spoiled latte might bring down the devil's own lawsuit, then you might think hard about saving up that $2,000 for your insurance policy. But you might have a hard time convincing the CFO to spend that much to make sure that the milk fridge in the warehouse break room is safe. Maybe there's a cheaper option. You can go to an office supply store or your telecommunications vendor and get a suitable unit for around $500. Or you can go to an internet gadget website and get a quite serviceable device for around $20. So maybe the office coffee club gets together and decides that they're sick of lumpy milk, and this week the person who collects $1 from each staff member for milk collects $2 instead, and goes and buys a $20 remote thermometer so that nobody risks losing a week's work to food poisoning. What happens next? Well, in some workplaces, the answer is that we discover that to our $20 sensor, we need to add $200 to get it tagged and tested, and another $900 to have an electrician come in and install a network port near the fridge. Then someone in IT pipes up that, oh, you should probably buy a license for Microsoft Power BI, and we should spin up another SQL server, and all of a sudden, the whole idea goes into the bin. So we might discover that in some enterprises, ludicrously cheap hardware only pays off to its full potential if we can also find a way to lessen the cost of infrastructure. So our first challenge is powering our devices. Power and communications are often linked, and sometimes we have one technology that does both. But I'm going to try and talk about power strategies first and communication strategies second. But things might get a little bit blurry in the middle there. Look, you can't beat wires. If you've got a power point in the right place, you're all set. But watch out for some gotchas. If your IoT gadget happens to have an American or a European power plug, then the cost of getting it changed might be prohibitive. And insurers take a dim view of DIY wiring or using travel adapters. So one key checklist when sourcing IoT products for the Australian enterprise is to make sure that you get a device with an Australian power plug and devices that meet Australian standards. Now, I do know of some importers who've gone to the effort of obtaining Australian certification themselves for devices that they import. And if you're rolling out enough of some product, you might choose that route. A heck of a lot of IoT devices, however, are going to run off 5 volts or 12 volts. And that means that they come with a weird plug pack that doesn't fit our sockets. We can just chuck it away and get another one locally. And again, you can pay 10 times too much for an Australian plug pack from some vendors. So if you are rolling out low voltage devices and need to bring your own power, you should cultivate a trustworthy electrical retailer who can supply power converters that aren't going to break the bank. Nowadays, when an appliance runs off low voltage, that's almost always the universal serial bus, those plugs that we all know from our computers and phones. Now, officially, USB ports only need to supply half an amp of current, so that's about 2.5 watts. And if you have a camera or some kind of actuator, it might need more power than that. But there's all kinds of extensions, official and unofficial, that let you get more power out of a USB socket. You can get up to 100 watts on paper with some ports, and I've actually calculated whether I could build a USB tea kettle for my friends who are stuck in the US with nowhere to make tea in their hotel rooms. But once again, if you're rolling out devices that accept power over USB, you will need to source a reliable USB adapter. You might be lucky enough to find that there's a USB port on the back of some machine that you can use to power a sensor, because that port is there for diagnostics or upgrades. And that can be a sneaky way to steal power for your IoT devices. But if you're sourcing your USB power converters, test them, because there are lies, damned lies, and maximum current ratings. If you're designing a device today that uses USB, then please just use a proper USB Type-C port that allows the device to negotiate for power, and you're sweet. If you're using wired networks, you might as well run power over those same wires. And there's 2 main ways to do this. If you've got network switches that support powered Ethernet, then maybe you're all set. Standard power over Ethernet is 48 volts, which is high enough to deliver a fair bit of power down thin wires, but low enough that nobody's going to get hurt. If your device can accept power over Ethernet, that's great, but you might have a device like a camera or a sensor that doesn't support power over Ethernet, and it just needs 5 volts or 12 volts. And you can get a splitter which will break that 48 volt power out to a 5 volt USB plug and an unpowered Ethernet. But maybe you don't have powered switches and you only want to power a handful of devices. In this case, you want to look for what's called a mid-span power injector. These can be built into a plug pack or a pair of wire splitters or resemble a small network hub with 2 sets of ports. In any case, they take ordinary Ethernet in one side, inject power onto the spare wires, and then you have a splitter at the other end which extracts the power to one plug and the network to another. And if you're lucky enough to have a building that has Ethernet cable routed absolutely everywhere, then being able to use that wiring to also power your sensors is a huge bonus. I design a lot of devices that are solar powered. It's not as simple as you'd think. If you're out in a paddock or up on a roof or in the ocean, solar is great until it rains for a week. So really, we're almost always talking about a combination of solar and battery. And whether you're designing or buying, you need to thoroughly understand what's the worst case combination of latitude, aspect, weather, and grime and malice that you might encounter that is going to take your theoretical maximum power level and start making you cry. You'll also see a number of off-the-shelf IoT devices that have solar panels and advertise that they're solar powered, but the solar panels are so small that they're merely decorative. There's just no substitute for doing your math when you buy. Having said all that, there's actually some hope for solar panels indoors, would you believe it? Silicon solar panels are pretty lousy in low light, but there's a new generation of panels using other chemistries that can harvest power indoors. Our friends just across the river at the University of Queensland have a lab working on this using perovskite cells. Batteries. Batteries are simultaneously great and terrible. The first time I built a battery-powered Wi-Fi sensor, I was so pleased with myself. It had a big lithium-ion cell next to a tiny little circuit board, and all I asked of it was to warn me of rain in time for me to get the washing inside when faced with Brisbane's notoriously sudden afternoon rain showers. I tested it with a sprinkler and it worked great, so I connected it to the washing line, retired inside to my island of contentment. An hour later it went flat. A little more research revealed that products that manage to run for months or years on battery do so by spending most of their time asleep and waking up only at rare intervals. If you need to be constantly monitoring, battery life is going to suffer a lot. In fact, I think I can predict that the single most pervasive struggle that you will encounter when planning your own products or rolling out your own architectures is going to be trading off your need to communicate with the battery impact of doing so. And your strategy for battery life is most likely going to be to work out how big of a battery you need and design for that, or pick a convenient battery size and then work out how can you make it last as long as possible. Nowadays, lithium rechargeable cells are everywhere, from the power grid to our cars, in everyone's phones and computers. They're finicky to care for, but we are spoiled for choice among special purpose components for charging and protecting these batteries. I could give a whole lecture on just batteries and power strategies. In fact, I did that in Christchurch last year, so you can look at it in the endnotes later if you're interested. And while you're at the drawing board, don't forget to calculate how long it would take for your battery to go flat on its own, even if you aren't drawing any power. There's a number of obscure types of battery that don't get much love, except for in sensors that have to run for years without going flat. They're special kinds of batteries with low self-discharge. And don't forget plain old alkaline dry cells. When you're looking for something to deliver low power for a long time, those are still in the game. If you've got wired power, there's a good chance you have a wired network too. But if not, perhaps you've got Wi-Fi, and because you're wired, you don't have to care about its power requirements. Wi-Fi is great. You find it everywhere. But if you're running on battery, you're going to need to use it sparingly. A little sensor that's just measuring temperature or moisture might happily get by with 10 or 20 milliamps when idle and just microamps when sleeping, but it'll need 150 milliamps or more when talking on the radio. So you, as a Wi-Fi connected IoT device, are in deep sleep, and you wake up to take a measurement, and now you're using 1,000 times as much power as when you were asleep. And then you need to transmit that measurement, and suddenly you're needing 10,000 times the power you were for a few seconds until you go back to sleep. I won't even talk about getting the Wi-Fi password into the device. I'll save that little treat for later. So, what else is there? Well, Bluetooth and Zigbee are both low-power alternatives that have a place in IoT. When you have an air gap of only a few meters, these can be ideal. In a densely instrumented installation, you might have an uplink that's sited wherever there is a convenient power and network, which then communicates with dozens or hundreds of nearby IoT devices over short-range radio. A Bluetooth sensor can run for 6 months on a coin cell and practically forever in human interface devices. When you've got something which goes to sleep until some human pushes a button, you can go for a very long time on a charge. One of my clients deploys sensors which spend most of their time asleep until the central system wakes them up, and they easily go a year on a single charge. You also have the option to create a mesh network of devices, which can reduce the number of fixed uplink devices you require, maybe even to zero. Mesh networks work by devices passing messages from one to the other until they get in range of whatever they need to talk to. Perhaps you have water quality sensors spread out along a river or around a reservoir. As long as one is in range of one or two of its neighbours, you potentially have a long-distance network for free. And there's a whole lot of things that I really hesitate to call IoT that use simple on-off signalling over radio to send messages. Think of garage door openers and remote control bed lamps or wireless security sensors. There's a number of radio bands reserved for these low-powered, unlicensed communications. In Australia, we have a 433 megahertz band, a 915 megahertz band, and the 2.4 gigahertz band, which is where Wi-Fi and Bluetooth hang out. And I use these devices in some IoT systems, but the really simple ones can be a pain because you don't know if they've gone flat, you can only communicate one way, and they've very rarely got any kind of security built in. But there's a new kid on the block in these same spectrum bands, a technology called LoRa. It's a spread spectrum protocol that lets many devices share the same frequencies, and there's a protocol called LoRaWAN, which lets you connect it to the internet. So you put a base station every few kilometres or around your site, and the device sets up an encrypted connection with the base station, and then the base station forwards these messages on to some internet message broker. We have a couple of free community-supported networks on LoRaWAN, including some stations run by the Brisbane City Council, and in many other cities, the local authorities have set up their own citywide networks for things like monitoring streetlights and park bins and waterway flow and quality. We're seeing the possibility of having one citywide network that looks after all of these low-speed devices. And then there's cell phones. If you're tracking vehicles, you can get a gadget that's essentially a cell phone without a screen or battery that plugs into the vehicle and transmits its location. Your cellular plan is going to cost you $30 a month or so, so you might fit one to a truck, but probably not to a dog or to a wheelie bin. But there's change afoot here too. There are two new cellular bands designed for IoT. They're technically 4G, but a lot of people lump them in with 5G. They're called LTE Category M1 and LTE Category NB1. Catchy names, I know. But the point of these bands is that they use slower speeds than phones, but can reach further and use less battery. That means they can work in basements and in factories where cellular reception isn't good, and the plans are priced much lower. For a modest amount of data, you can pay under $1 a month. So we're getting devices that cost under $50, are smaller than a credit card, and have affordable data plans. This can make cellular really compelling. Which is better, LoRa or cellular? I've been thinking about this for a few years now, and I still can't decide. Cellular means dealing with cellular operators, which some of my clients who picked LTE M1 will tell you is still a massive pain in the neck. So, we've decided to instrument our enterprise. We've navigated the challenges of power and communications. We've had several thousand devices out there communicating. But they're communicating with what? And are they all communicating? Or did 5% of them go flat and nobody noticed? Cloud is magic, right? Even the cloud vendors realise you can't have 10 million devices all phoning home to one point. So there's a couple of things we can do here. Well, you can add multiple cloud servers, a content ingestion network, that works. Secondly, you could add local tiers. Instead of having every light switch connecting direct to your cloud, have a building level or a city level hub. How hard can this be, right? Microservices are hip. We'll just add another one for data ingress and shard it. Well, you can do that, but if you're on a low data rate connection, then HTTP sends an awful lot of data just to push up one sensor reading. Persistent connections help a bit, but better solutions than HTTP are message buses. If you're the last person in the world who isn't on the pub sub bus, the idea is that you maintain a semi-permanent connection to a message broker, and you send short messages whenever you need to communicate, and you have the option to receive messages the same way. This fits really well with how LoRaWAN is designed, and it also happens to line up with the cheapest way to use cellular networks, where they like to charge you separately for every connection. WebSockets are message-based, a cloud compute server, a WebSocket connection, and you've got the essentials. The MVP for one of my startup clients works just like that. The next level of sophistication is to run your own message broker. A thing called MQTT is the protocol of choice here. It's dead easy to spin up an MQTT broker in a cloud server. It's relatively easy to provision a public key infrastructure to secure it all. I have a project on GitHub to do this. There's a link at the end of these slides. One advantage of doing it yourself is that you can replicate that message architecture into your development teams and into your continuous integration systems. But the disadvantage of doing it yourself is that you actually have to do it yourself and keep doing it, and keep doing it after it stops being fun. But it turns out that the IoT ecosystems from Amazon and Google and Microsoft are all based on MQTT. Thank you, gods of sanity. I've moved some of my projects over to Amazon's IoT, and I'm finding it pretty good. The offerings from the big cloud vendors all take the same approach. to solving one of MQTT's few flaws, which is dealing with disconnected clients. If my battery power budget requires me to spend 99% of my time asleep, then there's a good chance that I'm going to miss any message addressed to me. And Amazon and the others solve this with what they call a shadow document. The device maintains its current state, and changes to that state are communicated via MQTT messages. The cloud server also keeps track of the state, and more importantly, when a message is addressed to the device, the cloud service updates its copy of the state, called the shadow state, even if the device was offline. Then, whenever the device wakes up, it can synchronize its state with the shadow state, which means it can work out what it missed. The other thing the cloud vendor frameworks give you is device management. If you've got 1 million devices, then you should have 1 million passwords, and that gets real old real fast. The cloud vendors solve this with digital certificates. The devices generate their own random password, and they get a certificate somehow from the cloud service. Maybe you install it over a wire or on a SIM card, or it gets done at the factory. But these certified identities also hook into the access control lists for the message broker. For example, your fish tank cannot go rogue and explode your missile base. Sorry, James Bond. We as humans tend to be bad at planning for long time frames. Like when last year's phone doesn't have enough memory to run next year's OS, who could have seen that coming? But we've been trained to accept obsolescence in our phones. We get a little more irate when it's our TV or our stereo or our $200 million chemical refinery that stops working because the company that designed it 3 years ago got tired of fixing bugs. So when you plan an IoT architecture, you have to think for the long term. How long will these devices last? What's the mean time between failure? How many spares will you need? What's the plan for replacement when that day finally comes? What's your plan for if the vendor goes out of business or worse, gets bought by Google? Governments and consumer organisations have been thinking about this too. And one of the things that's recommended, and in some countries will become law, is a committed support lifetime. Your vendor should be able to tell you how long will they support a product, how long will they provide spares and bug fixes. In some cases, I'm now seeing vendors make 10 or 20-year commitments to certain of their models, which is a great step. And you might think that vendor support is a reason to pick a name brand over a company you've never heard of, but unfortunately the name brands can be just as bad at this as the also-rans. One thing that is a good sign is if there's a hacker community around a product. If people have enjoyed using a device so much that they've reverse engineered it in order to make it work with more of their systems, then you've got the possibility to continue getting value out of your hardware even after the original software has gone obsolete. And of course, if you can hand source a product that has open documentation and open source code, then you're in the best possible situation. Should the vendor stop being your friend, sometimes that means you have to design it yourself rather than buy it off the shelf. I would be very happy to see a regime where equipment sold for industrial and enterprise use must have design files and source code made available to buyers, or perhaps kept in escrow in case of vendor abandonment. One particularly pernicious problem that you'll encounter is when a perfectly working device stops working because some network service it relies on got retired. This has happened many times with book readers and music players, and yes, even light bulbs. I encourage you to be suspicious of IoT devices that rely on some network service operated by the vendor. I'm pleased to tell you that Microsoft and Amazon and Google and others are getting together to build a single IoT framework, embracing their incompatible protocols, and I hope that this is the beginning of the end for pointless lock-in. In the industrial automation arena, pointless lock-in is their bread and butter, and it's another of the reasons why I hope the Internet of Things eats their lunch. In the desktop computer arena, we're all familiar with Patch Tuesday. When each of us has one computer to look after, it can eventually wear us down until we give up and reboot so it can install updates. But if you've got 10,000 devices to reboot and update, you're never going to do it. So it's critical, in my opinion, that you be able to know what version your software devices are running, to know if there's any problem with that version, to know whether there's an update. Even if the vendor commits to providing updates for a long time, we still need help in knowing that these updates are necessary. Maybe your 15-year-old lighting controllers were installed by that engineer who just retired last week and nobody else knows how to update them or was subscribed to the email alerts. The very best situation is when you can roll out an update to a fleet of devices with a single button press, or even configure them to do it of their own accord. But don't wait until there's a nasty virus doing the rounds before learning how to take countermeasures. A bit topical there. No matter how well you plan, accept that no plan is perfect. Needs change and threats change. The whole point of information technology is to be able to see the future coming and to do something about it. So your architecture needs to be flexible. Perhaps some member of the organisation has a theory that needs data to prove it. You want your architecture to facilitate collecting new data that you didn't think you needed and combine it in new ways. The idea that a system is purchased and then is finished is probably faulty. If you did build something yourself, then you will probably be asking the organisation that did build it to modify it someday. At Accelerando, we aim to leave a client with everything they need to evolve and modify their systems. We hope that clients will come back to us to work further, but we don't aim to trap them into it. Plan for that kind of relationship. Price it in as a buyer or a seller. Keep the relationship open. Have retrospectives of whether a system is meeting its goals and whether those goals are the same. Design your architecture to enable change. Put the manual in the device if you can. Do everything you can with what you build to facilitate some eventual user doing something with it that you never thought of doing. It's 10 years from now. 5 years ago, that's in 2025, you took $1 and shaved it into 1,000,000 slices and bought a kilogram of sub-milligram sized computers, which you mixed into the paint at your new office complex. More than half of them died in the process of being painted on the walls, but you've still got about 400,000 nanocomputers out there sending data about noise levels and air quality and light levels and whether there's any new viruses in the air today. How do you cope with that much data? I divide my IoT data into 3 categories. Information about the devices themselves, aggregate information about the system, and application data. Now, the cloud services that you use to provision these devices are going to help you a lot to tunnel it to the right place and to sort it by type. Presumably somebody wanted all that data you're collecting, so build them a dashboard. Everyone loves a nice big supervillain screen like you see in the movies. They're largely useless, but you kind of have to build them to work out what's useful and what's not. So make a dashboard that shows all the ins and outs of your application, and then start working out how to make it so that nobody ever has to look at it. And that goes double for your housekeeping data. My approach with performance and health data is to just throw it into a data store, let it pile up. I don't even really bother to build visualizations initially beyond some basic availability monitoring. But when the wheels come off, when it turns out that mutant slugs have been undermining your building foundations or whatever, you'll know now what you needed to know then. And now you can start thinking about how to detect this class of problem next time. There's a lot of exciting stuff that's been happening in the past few years around using neural networks to detect anomalies. I cannot say enough about how awesome this is. When I worked in e-commerce, we spent years trying to codify all the system behaviors to detect anomalies. When you're working in an industry with a natural 500 to 1 transaction rate variability, it's really hard to tell an anomalous spike from a normal spike. Well, machine learning can. My go-to data bucket is a tool called Elasticsearch, which has an easy-to-use machine learning anomaly detection. You give it a week or so's data, it will learn the patterns, and it'll start to give you alerts on exceptions. And you can absolutely use Google's much more sophisticated machine learning tools if you have the need or the desire for those. So we have our thousands of sensors feeding into dashboards and data lakes. We're using machine learning, or at least artificial stupidity, to ignore the normal and highlight the abnormal. What now? Handcuff some human to the keyboard so they can act on it? The goal of this whole business, remember, is to free up humans from being roped to the plough. So our goal is to have observations lead to decisions, lead to actions, and to try and keep humans out of all of that. And this means that System A needs to tell System B what to do, even if one is Microsoft and one is Google and never the twain shall meet. So that final gift that cloud vendors give us are their rules engines. If this sensor sees thing A and some other level B is in the purple zone, then open valve C. You have a couple of choices when building a rule-based system. You can go all in on the cloud vendors with Amazon or Microsoft and Google and use their rules engines. They keep getting better and they integrate well with their AI and their computation and their messaging services. Second choice is you can take your standard business intelligence tools if yours supports rule processing and use that. Use the same tools that you use to inform all your other business decisions. Or you can build your own around an IoT-focused rules engine. Node-RED, which is originally from IBM and now under the umbrella of the JavaScript Foundation, is great and free. There's another one called thingsboard.io. It's a commercial product that I've been trying out recently and it seems very nice as well. But now it's time to act. We have to command some piece of our enterprise to do its thing. It's not perfect, but right now MQTT is probably the least awful way to tie two incompatible IoT systems together. Some slightly more awful ways include HTTP APIs or SMS messages or please no, the screaming email. If you do one thing when selecting an IoT component, work out whether it can talk MQTT, either directly or via the cloud vendor wrappers. If you can do that, you can probably use it to do anything. When you have two systems that don't quite line up, the duct tape that I use to tie them together is again Node-RED. This is a flow-based programming system. It's kind of like Scratch for grown-ups that knows how to talk to almost every protocol and device out there. If you've got two systems that you need to get talking, there's probably a way to do it with Node-RED. In my lab, it runs the door locks, it waters the plants, it even tells me if the toilet's occupied. Now, I want to circle back and talk about security again, across all those pieces we've examined. Again, I could talk for an hour on privacy and security in the IoT, and I did that about 10 years ago, back in this January. Geez, it feels like 10 years. There's a link to that video at the end, but right now I'm just going to tell you my top 5 security tips. Don't put the fish tank on the same network as the financial servers, okay? Your Wi-Fi routers are capable of running multiple networks, so do that. If you've got really crummy routers that can't do that, I bet they've at least got a guest network you can use. Don't be lazy. Don't use default passwords. Don't skip encryption because you think it's a private network. It's never a private network. Don't leave debugging backdoors in place. Verify signatures on updates. Plan to fail. Whatever security you build will fail. So have a second tier. It should take more than one mistake for somebody to break in and steal the crown jewels. Minimize the damage that a compromised component can cause. Use intrusion detection. Simplify, reuse. That's 2 things, but whatever. Think ants, not anteaters. There are good choices for operating systems and other components in embedded devices. Pick one and get good at it. For me, an ideal IoT device has a common core that is well tested and has well understood foundation behaviors, and then you build a simple set of application behaviors on top of that. And you learn from building special purpose devices to serve special jobs, but using the same parts. Build your intelligence in layers. And finally, don't stop learning. Educate and agitate about security. Your people are probably the easiest way to break security, so let them know what that looks like. Call them up and ask them to unlock the gate and see what they do. Walk around in a high-vis vest and a clipboard and see how far you can get. Okay, that was way too much to try and cram into one presentation, but we have come to the end. To recap, for me, the point of technology is to relieve humans from endless drudgery, and the Internet of Things is how we bring the benefits of the information revolution to the physical workplace. There's a whole lot of technical considerations involved in planning an IoT architecture, mostly about trade-offs, about trading off convenience and robustness, about battery life and communication speed. The one thing that makes IoT particularly hard are the time frames. When you set a computer in concrete, it really is forever. But don't forget, the goal of this is to make humans do less, not drown in data. And finally, better people make better products. So please go out and make great products. Thank you for your attention.